Yes.
Uh-oh.
Don't say anything bad.
Yeah. I did this talk in Lake City at the library several months ago, and I was just waiting like this, for time to start. And lady said, "You know why I came here tonight?" And I said, "Well, I don't have any idea." And she said, "I saw your books about disasters, and I wanted to hear about people whose lives are worse than mine." So if you came for that reason, I'm going to tell you about some people whose lives are definitely worse than yours. So, yeah.
We're gonna give it a few more minutes just to let any stragglers have a chance. If only because I have been straggling, so.
I did not know she.
Wow, that's impressive. New York Times, Chicago trip.
Yeah. That's over a long period of time.
That Chicago trip may not be there another few years.
You wonder how many of them are. It's horrible right now watching what's happening in the newspaper, and of course, I grew up reading the paper every day and for my whole life, and it's just I hate watching them go. And even I'm gonna talk a little bit about working as a newspaper reporter and watching just the destruction of the industry is amazing.
I hope that at least the New York Times still being published.
I hope so. Oh man. But I can remember hearing, I published several pieces in the Christian Science Monitor. They have a home forum section, which is personal essays. And I published quite a few in there over the years. And I remember when the Christian Science Monitor, which is a major international newspaper, went from daily to weekly. I couldn't even talk that day. There's no way. There's no way the Christian Science Monitor is going weekly. That can't happen. And it's still a weekly. Yeah. And probably never going back. Are we ready?
Yes, we are. It's 7 o'clock. So welcome to the History Center of Olmsted County, everyone. My name is Madeline Lawler, and I'm the education coordinator here. And for those of you on Zoom, we are recording. So if you want your video on, great. If you want it off, great. We also ask that you keep yourself muted until the end for questions, and you can drop them in the message area, and we will have a volunteer or myself read them off for you at the end. And as my boss is not here, but he would be disappointed if I didn't say, if you were a member, this could be free. But without further ado, here is Steve Gardiner, who will be talking to us about his book, Historic Disasters in Southeastern Minnesota.
Thank you, Madeline, for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. I will start out, before I get into the book, one of the things that you try, I think you try really hard as an author is to get people to, give you some attention. Are you familiar with Big River Magazine? Yeah, most people in the area are. And I ended up with a full-page review in there. This was last November and December. And then this one is probably more familiar here, Rochester Magazine. This one, boy, they ran one. Five pages. 5 pages. They ran an excerpt on that in the last November's issue. So I was really pleased to get that kind of coverage. It's amazing how much work it is to get just one of those things in. And so I've got 2 of them. for this book, and so I'm really pleased with that. I have a variety of things I want to talk to you about tonight. You see, I've got more than just the one book. I'll explain that briefly. I'm going to focus on the book Historic Disasters, but I will let you know what whoops. We're not, oh, where did Madeline go? Uh-oh. It worked just a minute ago. Oh.
Uh-oh. This is, yes.
Like you, somebody's trying to get off. Oh.
I don't like our internet here.
Oh, shoot.
Technology is wonderful when it works.
Yeah.
It's my favorite thing when
This is
it
one you know
works.
where the analog switch.
There we go.
Oh, okay, it's
It'll
working.
work.
Okay, all right.
That was on me.
Must have just gone to sleep. Okay, all right. Sorry about that. We did have it working, and I was assured that it was gonna work. I want to start out with this. How did we get here? Why are we here tonight talking about this particular book? How did it happen that this book came into existence? I sort of look at it as the story behind the story. And I think that's kind of interesting. I like hearing that from authors, and so I thought I'd share a little bit of that story with you to start off with, and then get into some of the specifics about the historic events. I was a high school English teacher for 38 years. I taught in Wyoming for quite a while, a year at the American School in Lima, Peru, and then 22 years in Billings, Montana. Retired in 2016. My wife and I both retired from teaching at the same time. And we were retired for a year, and then my daughter in Minneapolis had our first grandson. Life changed. All of a sudden, 13 hours from Billings to Minneapolis got to be way too long. Couldn't drive that far to hug that little guy. So we realized what's holding us in Billings, Montana? Absolutely nothing. And so we moved to Minnesota and didn't want to be in their backyard. We wanted to kind of be by a lake. Drove one weekend, just took a drive and drove through Lake City and said, uh-oh, I think we found it. We're gonna live in Lake City and live by a lake and have a boat, and we are doing that. So I was at that point. By the time I moved to Lake City, I was retired for 2 years, and I thought I'm not working anymore. And second week I lived in Lake City, I opened the newspaper, and there was an ad for a reporter for the Red Wing Republican Eagle. And I looked at my wife and I said, I have always wanted to try that, just even for 1 year or something. She said, go ahead and do it. I'll stay home by myself. You can go off and go to work. And I thought, except I'm already retired. They probably don't want some gray bearded guy running around writing their newspaper for them. They want some, 22-year-old with all kinds of energy. And she said, go ahead and put your name in and just see what happens. They hired me. And so I started working for the newspaper, and I thought, well, I'll work for a year and just see how it goes. And so I can say I did it. I stayed 3 and I just had an absolutely great time. I think teaching was my career, but newspaper was definitely my second act career. I loved it. I had so much fun, and I was new to this area, and they sent me out all over. I drove all over this area. Half the time my wife was with me, and we'd go out and do interview and take some pictures and go have lunch, and then I'd go do another interview and take some pictures and then go back and write the story. And so I got to meet all kinds of people around this area, see all the interesting stuff. And this area is just beautiful. You get to drive all these back roads and things like that. So I had absolutely great time. 2 years ago, then I re-retired, and this time I failed retirement once. This time I'm going to really try to make it stick. I think I'm trying to be done with it. How this leads to this book is the last few months that I was there at the newspaper. we started doing these things called premium editions. And they were just, we would pick a topic and just in depth, like 32 pages on this one topic. And one of them happened to be weather. It's a pretty important topic in Minnesota. People talk about it constantly. And so we put out this weather edition. It was a hit. And the month before I retired, I got an email. Now this is I've been doing freelance writing for newspapers and magazines and a couple of books along the way through my whole teaching career. I actually started freelance writing right when I started teaching, and so I was used to this thing of write a letter, don't beg, but try to get the guy to be interested in your article and publish it for you and all of that. And the last month that I was working, I got an email from an editor at the History Press. It's a branch of Arcadia Publications. And he said, I saw your article that you wrote about the 1965 flood. Would you be interested in writing a book? The editor's contacting me to write a book instead of me writing 100 letters to try to get a book published. I can't believe it. Well, of course I'm going to try it. And then I had to do the reality thing. Wait a minute. You did three. I did 3 articles for that particular weather edition, and they were on the sea wing disaster, the blizzard, and the flood, and 800 words each or something like that. And so he said, would you like to do a book on that? And okay. I wrote 800 words about the flood. Their books are 30,000 words. Can I write 30,000 words on that flood? I don't know. Maybe I could, but do I want to? Not really. And so what I did is I went back to that same editor and I said, look, I wrote about the sea wing, I wrote about the Armistice Day blizzard, and I wrote about the flood. What if I wrote a book on those 3 topics? I'm sure that's never been done. So he said that will work. And I said, here's the thing that ties them together. They're all related to Minnesota weather. They all happened in Southeast Minnesota, hence the title. And then I realized some other things. I thought, now this is kind of interesting. As I was writing back to him, they happened over a span of 75 years. The sea wing was in 1890, the blizzard in 1940, and the flood in 1965. They not only did that, they spanned the year. The sea wing was in July, the blizzard was in November, and the flood was in late February, March, and April. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And so then I had to match it with the format of their books. Again, I said they run about 30,000 words. It's not a huge book. I mean, that's not a really big book. They don't want to do massive tomes on history. That's not their thing. They're a hyper local company. We want something really local, and we want to go in, cover it, and get out. And I thought, I like that. I like that idea, but I've got to come up with 30,000 words, and I got to come up with 40 to 50 photos. Now, I've been to some of the historical archives in my newspaper research. I've been to Goodhue County, and I'd worked with Winona County historical archives for articles that I'd written for the paper. So I knew stuff exists. It's out there. Am I going to be able to find enough? And so I wrote the proposal, and I decided, this is just my decision, not the editors, that when I start in on this, every one of these stories has its set of facts that go along with it. When did it happen? How much damage occurred? How many people died? All that factual stuff that you need for history. But I decided I'm going to see how many personal stories I can find of these, and not just have a fact, but maybe this is the English teacher characterization coming in or something like that. I want to create some, not create, I want to find and report some characters that make the stories a little bit more lively. And so that was my goal. I think I did it. If you read it, I hope you think I did it. I don't know, but that was my goal in doing this. So now I'll go into, I'm just going to do a brief summary of each of the events. Maybe you know about them, maybe you don't know about them, but I'd like to cover them just briefly. The Sea Wing disaster happened in Lake Pepin, just north of Central Point at Lake City. It's the largest maritime disaster in Minnesota history. It's not the largest in the United States. The USS Sultana was a ship in the Civil War. It was down by Memphis, and it had a capacity of 376 people. They put 2,300 Union prisoners of war on the ship, designed for 376 people. It exploded, went to the bottom. 1,700 of them died in one brief instance there. So that's the largest. But the Sea Wing is the largest in Minnesota history, and I'll tell you just a little bit more about that. In terms of the weather, it was a straight line wind. If you know where Hanson's Harbor is, just north of Lake City, the storm came down through there. And the interesting thing is that the same storm had already leveled good chunks of Hastings and Red Wing. It had turned over some vehicles in the Twin Cities. And here's Captain David Weathern. He'd taken a boatload of people down to Camp Lakeview, a National Guard camp just on the south edge of Lake City, about where the Sportsman's Club is now. And he was leaving. They'd gone through all the festivities of the day and so on, bands playing, military parades and all of that. And then they were leaving, and he questioned the weather, but it'll be fine. And then came around, and this is the view they had coming. That Central Point that's sticking out there on the left-hand side, and then the bluff in the back is Maiden Rock in Wisconsin. And he came out around that and was not very far from Central Point when the straight line wind came in. He turned into it to try to face it head on, didn't make it, and the boat rolled over. The Sea Wing was Captain Weathern's boat, and it was not a cruise ship. It was actually a logging ship, but it was Sunday afternoon, and he thought, I'm not hauling logs today. I'll haul people, and I'll charge them 50 cents a piece, and we'll have a good afternoon down in Lake City, and I'll make some extra money. So he had the Sea Wing loaded, and then he had attached to the side of the Sea Wing a barge named the Jim Grant. So the two were attached together, and he had them both full. Was he over full? It depends on who you talk to. This is one of the really interesting things about doing this kind of research. I'm going to talk several times today about the variables that happen when you're doing historic research. Even contemporary stories don't always agree. Read the paper here right now. Accounts don't always agree on what happened in a certain incident. So you have to wade through that as a history writer. What are you going to write? And so usually I just left it. He said this and he said that, and you decide which one you believe. That seemed to be the best way to do it. But Captain Weathern came out around Central Point, was planning to hug the Mississippi shore and go on up, got a little farther out, and then that straight line wind hit, dumped him over. When the rain started, these were nice people, they were like the guys on the ship were gentlemen. And so what did they do? They sent all the women and children inside the cabin. The boat flipped. So that it basically every woman and child on the boat had no chance at all. And so it flipped, and within minutes, 98 people were gone, within minutes. Red Wing today has 16,000 people, 16,000 people. 77 of the people who died were from Red Wing. Now, in a town of 16,000, if you had 77 deaths in one afternoon, that would be pretty significant news. In 1890, there were 6,000. This was a big chunk of the town. They had weddings, sorry, funerals for 4 days straight, just nonstop. One funeral and another funeral and another funeral for 4 straight days. The town shut down. It was absolutely amazing. I said I'd talk about some variables in the history, and to me, it's actually kind of interesting that these variables come up. And one of the main variables on this story is the fact that the 2 boats were tied together. And after the storm, they were not tied together. And so there's varying accounts of what happened. I read accounts that said the captain ordered the hawsers cut between the 2 boats. I've read that the passengers on the Jim Grant realized the Sea Wing was going over and said, "We're not going over with it," and cut it off. And so there were varying. Oh, and then another account just said the action of the boat tipping over broke the hawsers in half and separated the 2 boats. So there's multiple stories there, and even the captain, David Weathern, gave one story at the moment, like the week after, and then I read an account that where somebody had interviewed him. I think it was 38 years later, and he gave quite a bit different account of how the 2 boats became separated. So again, I think that this is kind of an interesting thing when you're doing this historic research. I think in general, I tend to put more weight on the contemporary account, the one that happened right there, rather than his account 38 years later. He's had a lot of time to figure out how he wants to have his legacy. And so anyway, that's something that you have to deal with in this, and it can be confusing at times when you read, wait a minute, that's not what I read earlier, and then you get 3 or 4 versions of the story. So the Sea Wing, an incredibly interesting story, and that is the monument at Levy Park in Red Wing, listing all of the people who died in the Sea Wing disaster. Then on to the Armistice Day blizzard. Armistice Day in 1940. I think in 54 it became Veterans Day, and so it's the same holiday, just with a different name. And this is an interesting storm. The storm that created the Armistice Day blizzard is the same storm that tore down the Tacoma Narrows Bridge south of Seattle. Wow! It tore down that bridge, and then came and was heading southeast, curved across Colorado, halted for a while, got itself rested, built up strength, and then roared through the Midwest and just created havoc everywhere. Okay, it was the first 2 are interesting because they're sudden storms. The Sea Wing, boom, straight line wind, boat's over. Just in a matter of a minute or 2, they're on the water, and a minute or 2 later, there are 98 people dead in the water, just like that. This one, pretty much the same thing. Armistice Day, it was a long weekend, and the duck hunters were out in droves, and it was really nice. And they were out in t-shirts, and all of a sudden it's raining, and then it's snowing, and then it's freezing, and many of them they were in their duck blinds, just solid blocks of ice, because they couldn't get off the islands. The water was whipping up so much. And again, there are discrepancies in these stories of who did what and so on. I'll talk about 2 people that are generally considered heroes of the Armistice Day blizzard. The first is Abe Kuhns. He was up at Prairie Island, lived on a farm there, hunted and fished on the river, knew the area really well, had his little rowboat. And when he heard that there were people trapped on an island nearby, he rowed out, and he was able to save a couple people. Again, varying stories. The Minnesota Safety Council gave Abe an award for heroism, and cited in their citation for the award that Abe rowed out into the river to the island 3 times and saved 6 people. Okay. Another guy who was there, Owen Redman, who lived in Red Wing, and he was out on the river looking for people as well. Was interviewed in 1990, 50 years after the event, in the Red Wing Republican Eagle, and he said Abe made 6 trips out into the river to save people. I guess in the end it doesn't matter. He put his life on the line and saved multiple people, and he was the descriptions of some of the accounts of him rowing. You can picture this blizzard and freezing rain, and his oars are just draped in ice, and his coat's draped in ice, and his head's draped in ice, and he's out there rowing and trying to pull these people in. So it's an incredible story. If he went out 3 times or 6 times in one way, it doesn't matter. He was definitely a hero for the day. Now, down in Winona, there was a guy named Max Conrad, and the Winona people were having just as much trouble as they were up at Prairie Island in terms of people trapped out on islands, got suckered in by the very nice weather, and were out hunting. And of course, when the storm came in, guess what happened? The duck hunting was amazing. The ducks were just coming in, and so they're just shooting and shooting and shooting, and now they're not focused on the weather at all. They got ducks all over the place, and so they're having just the greatest day of the season. And then many of them 2 hours later are dead from that moving in so quickly. Max Conrad was a famous pilot. Had a small plane, and he had set all sorts of world's records, transatlantic flights and long distance flights and all kinds of things. And he loaded up his plane and figured out he was going to try to go up and see if he could just locate. Well, what they figured out the best thing to do was for Max to fly over, and if he looked down and saw hunters on an island, then he would circle. And then the rescuers, he obviously couldn't land. The rescuers would see Max circling, and they would know, okay, excuse me, there's somebody on that island. Sorry about that. And then the other thing he figured out he could do is fly over, have his window open, and yell down to him, "Don't move, somebody's coming." Or if he knew he was in a place where there was not a rescue boat on the way, he would yell down, "Go in the direction that I'm going to fly." And then he would turn and guide them out to a direction where they could go. The same thing, some discrepancies there on how many flights did Max make over the, he couldn't go out the day of the storm. He had to go out the next day. The storm was, even the next day, he took off and said his plane, just after he took off, just stalled. He was going into the wind, and it just held him, and he finally got it moving forward so that he could fly. Interesting point. The Winona Airport is now Max Conrad Field, so that's where that came from. The storm was just absolutely huge, and I know you're sitting there thinking, so why didn't they know? If it went all the way from Tacoma, Washington, to Colorado, to Kansas, and up through Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan, and wiped out things everywhere, and have forecasting. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. The lack of what they had. There was a game warden named Willis Kruger, and he was brand new on the job, working for the DNR and taking care of people out there. And so he, on this day, was all excited because, boy, it's beautiful weather. Hunters are going to be out everywhere. Everybody's going to be happy. This is going to be absolutely great. And Kruger was, even though he was fairly new on the job, was noted for taking really good field notes of, what he did with each day and how he worked with the people and so on. And one paragraph for you on this one. Willis Kruger was new on the job as a game warden when he was thrust into the fiercest of the Armistice Day blizzard. He worked along the Mississippi River in Wabasha County and was intending to go out and check duck hunters' licenses that day. Instead, he ended up spending the day warning hunters to go home and then spent the next several days searching for and rescuing others. There was one telling comment in his field notes for November 11th: did not get home. He wasn't the only one. Many people did not get home that day. Not only the hunters and the boaters, but they just blanketed this area. There were cars in the ditch everywhere. There was a massive pileup just south of Twin Cities. I think it involved something like 100 cars or something like that. And then there were travelers that just simply, we can't drive anymore, spent the night in their car, things like that. Again, another thing of discrepancies: how many people died because of the Armistice Day blizzard? These two statistics from the Midwest, 154, and in Minnesota, 49, come from the Rochester Post-Bulletin. I had to pick a source somewhere, but then it also defines exactly how do you define who's in the Midwest, who died in the Midwest, and who's now outside of the Midwest. So there are some variables there. But anyway, it was significant. There was significant loss of life in this, and there are multiple stories in here about hunters on the islands trying to get off, stranded motorists who didn't get home for 3 days and then finally got back to see their families and so on. I want to read one more story out of just about the blizzard here. And in Rochester was playing on that Saturday. Rochester was playing Winona in football in the afternoon, and the storm was getting worse and worse, and they were trying to play a football game, and the announcer was had this good sense of humor and saying things like, well, it's getting a little harder to tell where the edge of the field are, where the yard lines are, having trouble telling that. Now I'm kind of having trouble reading the numbers on the players' backs. And eventually it came to a point of, I can't really even tell who's on which team anymore. And apparently there was at some point a punt that took off and then went for negative yardage. So the game was, it ended with the Winona players ended up spending the night in the homes of the Rochester players. And so that set up the idea of football. And so I've got another story here from with a football connection. Another story from the day with a football connection involved a 14-year-old hunter named Bud who went out with a friend his own age and an older friend who worked as a barber. They were hunting near Yellow Lake near Siren, Wisconsin. The barber stayed at the cabin while the other two went out. They hunted a while, but decided to return to the cabin when the snowfall became thick. They struggled, then they got disoriented, according to an account in the Rochester Post-Bulletin. They heard a train and knew the cabin was near the tracks. Bud's partner said he could go no further, so Bud returned to the cabin and started a fire to warm up. The barber went back and helped the other boy back to the cabin. The three stood by the fire until they were warm, then set out in the car to drive home. They got stranded and spent the night in the car. In the morning, Bud was the only one with dry boots, so he set out and walked 3 miles to a country store. The telephone was down, so Bud was afraid his friends had died in the storm. They assumed the same about him. It was 2 days before they all learned that through different means of help, they had all survived. Bud Grant lived through the blizzard and eventually became the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings in 1967. Now, when I wrote this, Bud was still alive, and you may have caught last year when he passed away. This story was in the Star Tribune, and I wasn't from here, so I didn't know anything about the story. But I came here to the Olmsted County History Center, and I was next door in the archives looking through old newspapers, and I stumbled across this story. Now, for a writer, you don't know what that feels like. My drive back to Lake City that day, I was just floating back. I get to put this story about Bud Grant in my book. I can't believe I found that today. As that was the last thing I expected. I was looking for just details about the storm and weather reports and all of that. I came across this story about Bud Grant. So that's what those moments make riding really fun. Now, the Mississippi flood of 1965. There was that book a few years ago called The Perfect Storm. I would call this one The Perfect Flood. It came in two parts, starting in late February. Well, what happened earlier actually is in November and December, it was freezing cold and the ground froze deeper than usual. And so it was the permafrost became, or not permafrost, but the frost depth was much deeper than it normally would be. And so then there were some rains, particularly in the Rochester and Cannon Falls area in late February and early March. And so the flood, it depended on where you were, how this worked. Rochester and Cannon Falls got the flood first, the first wave of it. And then it got cold again and froze, and then some snow fell, and that became insulation on top of the frozen ground, keeping it frozen. And then in April, I think they recorded 3.5 inches of rain coming down on land that was basically a tin roof. There was nothing going into the ground at all, and it was all just running straight off. And so then it started flooding other tributaries. Then of course the Mississippi just went crazy. I mentioned Hanson's Harbor just a minute ago. Andrella Hanson and her husband started Hanson's Harbor. It was an interesting. I didn't know this until I was doing this research. I actually keep my boat at Hanson's Harbor. It was a pond on the side of the river, and so all they had to do was just cut a hole, and then they had the harbor. They didn't have to dig the harbor. It was a pond, and they just cut a passage in and made it. And so that was in '52, and Andrella and her husband opened Hanson's Harbor, and so she well, here I'll just read a little bit out of her diary. Is absolutely incredible. This was another great find to come along, this lady's personal diary. On April 21st, Andrella Hanson wrote in her diary that the rivers dropped 7 inches. That was good news. But then, as if a record flood had not been challenging enough, she added news that Lawrence Peterson, a longtime friend of their family, had died of a heart attack, and Alice Hanson, another friend, was in the hospital from a heart attack. Quote, "So much trouble," Andrella wrote. And this is after she'd been recording the increasing every day, the depth increasing, and all these accounts of what they had to do. The next day, Elmer Bankston, a friend from Red Wing, stayed with the boys while the Hansons went to the Peterson funeral. Andrella summed up the time writing, quote, "We're terribly tired." She's capturing everybody in the region after 2 months of flooding. Then she went through a whole series of measurements of the receding water. Over the next 2 days, the Hansons tried to return to a normal life. Andrella went for a haircut. They moved furniture back into place. They replaced docks and began the long process of cleaning the buildings and areas. On May 1, there was a relief in her tone when she writes, quote, "The river is about 14 feet, and I guess we are saved now. The Lord was willing that we should be okay. By the grace of God and much help from our friends and neighbors and our 3 sons, we will be back in business shortly." And they were. And her son Pete ran Hanson's Harbor until a few years ago, and then his son Alan owns Hanson's Harbor right now. When I started working on this, I talked to Pete and Alan a little bit about what it was like to experience that when your business is based on the water, but not that much water. And Alan told me a really interesting thing. He said, "Okay, you've been out on Lake Pepin. Just picture Lake Pepin in your mind, and think, it goes but from Lock 3 to Lock 4, it's 50 miles. Pretty wide. That's a lot of water. Think of what it takes to take Lake Pepin and raise it 1 inch. How much water it takes to raise it 1 inch. And then, because think about this also, as you go up, it also, go ahead. It gets wider because you've got a valley like this. So every inch you go up, you go out. And so you raise it 3 feet, which that's just an unfathomable amount of water. And then what we're talking about, much more than that, feet and feet and feet going up and then going out yards and filling in all the backwaters and running into the tributaries and all of that. Absolutely amazing what that does. It affected human beings, and this is different. This was not a straight line wind that flipped a ship or a storm that came in and froze hunters on an island. This drug on and on and on, and just seemed like it was never going to end. And it was not only humans. There's a good picture of the Red Wing Railroad track. Railroads, roads were destroyed. The birds and animals, they just went crazy. And I didn't even think about this, and I found one account that said one of the worst things was, of course, is that all the animals and birds that were moved out of their habitat, and of course they ended up on the road and became victims then. They didn't die in the flood, but were moved out and trying to get across the road and got killed then. So the red-winged Republican eagle used a phrase, the silent siege, to describe this. They ran a 30-page special edition on this and did a great job. The waters receded over days and weeks, leaving behind a path of destruction. Homes and businesses had been damaged, cars had been swamped, personal property had floated down the raging river, lives had been lost. Communities faced significant debt as they worked to rebuild. Organizations and individuals stepped up to provide money and labor to help their fellow citizens get their lives back in order. On the Mississippi River and its tributaries, the flood crests of 1965 stand as records to this day. Most were a foot higher than the second highest crest in most locations, according to the National Weather Service. The fearful buildup and the agonizing retreat of the 1965 flood left many people devastated. The Daily Republican Eagle wrote, quote, "For thousands of Mississippi River bank residents, the word flood will bring to mind 1965, and the combination of the two will bring a shudder to all who witnessed the massive silent siege." This is interesting that I'm having trouble with my voice here in the last minute. Of course, during my teaching career, talking for an hour would have been nothing. I'm not teaching anymore, and I'm paying the price for it right now. Okay, so the results. I said I'd talk about this. We had these 3 major storms in our area, and they were tragedies. By any measurement, they were tragedies: financial, life loss, property damage, however you want to measure it, they were tragedies. But some things came out. We talked about earlier about weather forecasting and tracking. The weather station used to run 9 to 5, and then it was shut down for 16 hours until 9 o'clock the next morning. And if something happened in the night, they never knew. And even like the straight line wind that tore up Red Wing, Captain Weathern had no idea. He would have never left Camp Lakeview if he had known that Red Wing was being torn to pieces. But they had no way of knowing that. They had no way at all. So that's one thing. Lots of things that come about in flood prevention and funding and policies on how to deal with those kinds of things. And then, of course, better information sharing and communication. Today we get angry if it said it was going to rain at 10 o'clock and it's already 11 and it hasn't rained yet. What's wrong with them? We expect that kind of precision now, and these guys had none of that, none of it at all. Okay, so that's again, that's a brief summary of historic disasters in Southeast Minnesota. Let me talk just briefly. I brought some other books with me here, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I will stay around if you're interested. I'll have these books for sale. I'd be happy to sign them, talk to you, whatever you'd like to do. when I was living in Wyoming and Montana, I did a lot of outdoor activities, cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, backpacking, mountain climbing, and it extended well beyond just the Rocky Mountains, kind of all around the world in some cases. And so the first book, briefly, is called High Pointing for Tibet. High pointing is a sport where you mountain climbing, you often want to go find the hardest route or the most difficult peak or something. High pointing is going just to the highest point in a geographical region, even if it's not that significant, just to say I was at the highest point. We set out to high point all 50 states. Okay, Montana, that's a challenge. Wyoming, that's a challenge. Alaska, it's a huge challenge. Not so much in Iowa. You drive up to a farm and you pull into the parking lot and you get out and you walk about 20 feet and there's a monument that says Hawkeye Point, and you are on the high point in the state. Okay, and there's lots of other, Florida and Illinois and lots of states that are that way, that are really easy. But our group made it to the high point of 48 states. And so it became the journey to support the Rowell Fund. Galen Rowell was a really famous outdoor photographer. Lots of Life magazine stories, National Geographic stories, lots of books. And the group that did this project, we were on an expedition with him in northern Greenland. We climbed a bunch of mountains with him. And unfortunately, 5 years after that, he was killed in a plane crash, small plane crash in California. So we created the High Pointing Project as a fundraiser to help the Rowell Fund. Galen was a huge fan of Tibet, and I don't know if you have paid attention to the Chinese have occupied Tibet for 50 years. Nobody seems to be interested in helping them. Galen tried. So we donated to that fund, which supports Tibetan artists, writers, and musicians. And we thought that was kind of fun. So anyway, that book is about going out and climbing 48 of the 50 state high points. And then it's the background of the Tibetan cause and our support of that. Adventure relativity. You can't do outdoor adventures without finding yourself in situations. Yeah, it's going to happen. You're going to find yourself in a situation where I shouldn't be here, kind of like the duck hunters on the islands. I shouldn't be here on this day. And so I noticed that when I was in a situation like that, I had oftentimes a different perception of time. Sometimes it just raced past, and other times each second seemed like it was going to be a lifetime until whatever was going on ended. A couple stories in there. I took my 16-year-old daughter, yes, the one in Minneapolis who had my 2 grandsons. When she was 15, I took her to Africa to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, and she did a great job. We took 7 days, climbed up to the top, turned around, started back down, and she lay down in the middle of the trail sick. And I thought, and I met my medical doctor, me with years and years of mountain climbing experience. This doesn't happen this way. You get sick going up, you turn around, you go down, you feel better. That's just the rule. And she marched to the top and turned around, and then she couldn't even move. I ended up having to hire porters to carry her down, take her to a hospital, emergency surgery in Africa. She's fine. She had my 2 grandsons. I saw her this morning. So anyway, that was a huge sense of time. Those days where, okay. And there's some other stories in there. I have a story about going spelunking, crawling through a cave and getting into a point where we had to get down and literally pull with our fingers and push with our toes, and you could feel the rocks sliding down, and that's a different sense of time. And then I decided at one point I wanted to run a couple marathons, and then I got interested in trying to qualify for the Boston Marathon. That's a different sense of time ticking and how important it is. So anyway, it became adventure relativity. You know, Einstein's theory of relativity says we perceive time in different ways. So I stole that name from him. Then I decided I had some things that I wanted to write about my mountain climbing specifically. And I started climbing when I moved to Wyoming. I was in a town called Gillette, Wyoming, and 60 miles away is Devil's Tower National Monument. And I walked around it one day and said, wow. I had never touched a climbing rope. I didn't know what a carabiner was. I didn't know how you put a seat harness on, nothing. But I said, wow, that would be interesting to be up on top of that. This is the rock was in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And in fact, the year that movie came out, that's when I moved there. And so it was like, well, you gotta climb it now. And I met a guy, a teacher, who climbed it every weekend. And I said, wow, I'd love to get up there. He said, what are you doing Saturday? And I said, well, I don't know. He said, let's go. And he took me to the top, and that was it. I was hooked. And I went back the next weekend and the next weekend. By the end of my first summer as a teacher, I climbed it 32 times. And it just went on, and then it just exploded to climbing in the Tetons and climbing in the Wind Rivers, and then in Yosemite and Alaska and on. And I realized, so this book, Mountain Dreams, then is about, it starts with that first climb on Devil's Tower, and then it spans a decade going to these other, Alaska and these other places, and then ends the day that I got back from, so that was 1978, and in 1988, I got to go on a trip to the North Face of Mount Everest. And so it ends with me getting home after a decade of climbing. I didn't climb for a decade, no, over a span, and getting home from Everest. And so that wraps up that book. So anyway, there's kind of different versions of adventure and so on. And then of course the history book. And then I have just one other thing to mention. On September 11th, my next book is coming out. And this is also related to my work at the Red Wing Republican Eagle. The last big project that the editor Ann Jacobson gave me was, she said, there's so many bridges around here. Well, there's more than so many. Minnesota is called the land of 10,000 lakes. If you look on the MnDOT website, according to their statistics, it could be called the land of 20,000 bridges. You don't have this much water without having lots of bridges. And so they're all over. And so I played with the title, Historic Disasters in Southeast Minnesota. And I enjoyed working with this company, the History Press. I enjoyed my editor. I enjoyed the copy editors. It was just a good process. I like how the book turned out. It looks nice. It's nice paper, everything like that. And so I went back to the same editor and I said, hey, another project that I did, I wrote about some bridges. I'd like to write about bridges in Southeast Minnesota. And he said, sounds like a great idea to me. And he took it to the editorial board. They said yes. And he said, but I have to change it. I've got to ask you for something that I didn't last time. Remember I said it was 30,000 words and 40 to 50 pictures? This one he wanted 32,000 words and 140 pictures. Well, fortunately, in my time at the newspaper, I had gone around and then I just got it. You started on something and all of a sudden you just notice, that's a through truss bridge. Oh, that's a deck truss bridge. Oh, that's a suspension bridge. And I started noticing those kind of things. And then I'd be driving and I don't need this picture, but that's a good bridge picture. And I took it. So I had like 1,000 bridge pictures on my computer when I quit working. And then I realized, okay, there's a lot more that I don't have. But again, my wife and I jumped in the car. We'd go somewhere, take a bunch of bridge pictures, have lunch, go find some other bridges, take pictures of them. So anyway, that book is out next month. And that's the bottom bridge is in Lanesboro, Wabasha, the Lowry Bridge, and it's the Stone Arch Bridge, and then of course Zumbrota. And then on the back cover is Hastings. And so it starts right at the edge of the Twin Cities there, and then comes down the Mississippi. And 7 chapters deal with the Hastings Bridge, the Red Wing Bridge, the Wabasha Bridge, the La Crosse Bridge, the Winona Bridge, like that, and then smaller bridges that are in that geographic area, and then Rochester. So it's the only area that's not on the Mississippi, but there's plenty of bridges here around this area, and that are very, very, very pretty. So there's 140 pictures in there. I think I didn't count, but I'm just guessing I took 100 of them, and then got 40 from the historical societies. And fascinating stories. It was another great project for me to work on. So I've done 2 history books and 3 of the outdoor adventure books. So that's where I'm at right now. Questions? Yes, there are more ideas, and they'll continue to come. Did you have something?
Well, the thing, I grew up in Red Wing,
Okay.
so in '65, drove over to the island there, because that was all underwater.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And you told me a couple of stories. Go ahead.
Well, they had to build a 17, 18-foot dike along the edge of the Mississippi River. And we got out of high school for a while. And once the levees were up, we had we used to call it the sandbag watch, because we had like little forts, if you will, made out of sandbags, and 3 or 4 of us in there. And then every 15, 20 minutes, one of us would have to go out. We'd cover a certain section, and we were looking for leaks into the dike area. And so it was a rather interesting event, but the water was everywhere. And strangely, well, not strangely enough, but as I remember, the water started really becoming noticeable by mid-March.
Yeah.
And work on the dike started.
You're talking about Winona.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the work on the dike started probably the last week or so of March. And they had earth scrapers and dump trucks in there, like a whole army of people.
I read about that. Yeah. And then it peaked about mid-April. Yeah.
Yeah, and by graduation time from high school was June the 8th. And a week before that, water was down to normal, and we were water skiing and boating and everything. So
Okay.
And I had ancestors on the Sea Wing.
Oh, really? Oh, I've never heard that one yet. Okay.
Warren Sparks, maybe you've read his name.
I think I saw that name.
That was my great grandfather.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Few other
Because I was just gonna ask, when I do this, a lot of times I get people telling me memories of the 1965 flood. I just wondered if anybody had any memories of the Sea Wing disaster.
I grew up listening to it all the time.
That's 1890. I don't think anybody has memories from this. Any other questions?
I just heard there were plenty of shares of floods. By every 5 years.
Yeah. It's kind of a different system. Yeah.
What did Max Conrad have?
Ooh, I can't tell you that.
He's got connections with
Late
Rochester.
60s,
Oh, yeah.
He was,
68 or 69.
Okay.
He died.
Okay. Yeah.
he was, the airport, what they had for an airport in Winona was closing. And he was coming to Rochester to teach flying in the 20s.
Okay.
And in the teens and the 20s.
Yeah.
And in 30 or 31, the first nighttime baseball game ever played in Minnesota was played in Rochester. And the day that of the game, the light bulbs didn't show up. And Max Conrad is the one who flew to Chicago and got the light bulbs. and came back.
Max is just a hero in all kinds of ways, isn't he? Yeah, he's a good guy. Good guy.
He's a nice man. I had occasion to
Oh,
meet him
did
once.
you meet him? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Enjoyed talking with you, and I'll be up. Oh, just real briefly, so that you know, these are oh, I forget, they're about $22, but I'll do 20 tonight. And then all three of the adventure books, I'll do 15. So if you want any of those, please come up and get them, and I'll be happy to sign them. And otherwise, enjoyed talking with you, hearing your stories. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for coming.
So you worked at the Republican Eagle?
I worked at the Republican Eagle for 3 years.
What year?